welcome to video 2 for PSC 355. And in this video, we're going to compare two different development models that were used throughout the developing world in the post-war era. And so the central question we're going to ask and answer in this video is, how have governments used trade policy in an effort to promote economic development? And we're going to look at two different approaches, which you've read about this week as well. Import substitution industrialization, or ISI, and export-oriented industrialization, or EOI. In your textbook, this is referred to as the East Asian model, EOI is, and so they're synonymous here, just to clear that up. So ISI is most associated with Latin America in the 1950s through the early 1980s. Other countries used it as well, like India and many African countries used this development model, but it's mostly associated with big Latin American countries like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, even Mexico. ISI, the goal of this strategy was to generate industrialization. You wanted to industrialize, and you wanted to do this by promoting domestic consumption of domestically produced goods. You didn't want your citizens buying American cars or buying American stereos or Japanese stereos. You wanted them to buy domestically produced goods. You wanted to create industries within your economy that you didn't have. You didn't want to be a agricultural or primary producer anymore. You wanted to become like the rich world. This was essentially influenced, as we discussed in the previous video, by dependency theory. You wanted to develop and industrialize, you had to unplug. And so you would sell your goods to your big internal markets, these were large countries, and you wouldn't export goods. You weren't trying to be part of the global economy anymore. You were focused on that internal market. And you would do this by promoting a particular kind of industrial strategy. You would impose high barriers to trade. You would provide subsidies to these developing infant industries, and in many cases the state would own key sectors of the economy, key enterprises. And we can see how this is influenced by industrial policy, which we've talked about already, by dependency theory, and by the concept of infant industry protection. Governments used high barriers to trade. The average tariffs on manufactured imports throughout Latin America during this era were very, very high. Imports were strictly forbidden in some cases. You wouldn't even allow foreign competition in. Though certain inputs for manufacturing, machinery built abroad, that was allowed because these governments felt you needed to allow that machinery in so you could actually create the factories in industry that you needed to develop. The basic premise here was, if you could make it in Latin America, then you wouldn't allow that in, or you would at least restrict it to make domestically produced goods the most competitive within your internal market. Prices were much higher, as you would expect. These cheaper foreign goods that were of higher quality, the prices of these goods were distorted because of trade. And so if you lived within one of these countries, you had to pay a lot more for the same kinds of goods because of trade restrictions. Industries were also given subsidies, tax breaks, cheap credit from state-owned banks. They were given preferential access to those capital goods we talked about previously, preferential access and cheaper prices to raw materials. And governments also used their exchange rates to make their industries more competitive as well. We'll talk about exchange rates in a few classes that will help make that more clear. The state also owned key enterprises in the economy. Governments owned things like infrastructure, railroads, telecommunications. This was not that uncommon even in Western Europe during this time. But governments also owned things like steel mills, chemical factories, oil wells and refineries. Governments owned mines, again, to get those resources and provide them cheaply to the industries. To put this in perspective here, the public sector, the state, accounted for anywhere from 25 to 50% of investment in the region's economies. This is compared to 5% or less than 5% in the US for a very long period of time. In other words, the state accounted for 5 to 10 times more of investment in these economies than the state accounts for investment in the United States. So a huge role for the state in these economies. Supporters claim that, hey, you had to do this. The state needed to be investing because private investment was not going to finance these key industries. Again, you might need to temporarily distort trade in order to promote development in key sectors. This is sort of the heart of infant industry protection and industrial policy. So did it work? Initially, ISI produced high growth rates until the mid-60s, but by the late 60s and especially through the 70s and 80s, three cracks became apparent. governments were running large budget deficits, largely because they were funneling all this money and cheap credit to these industries that never actually became competitive. Governments ran large trade deficits. They were actually buying more, importing more, even though they were trying to substitute imports. They had to import those machinery products and things to promote industrialization. They still had to import oil, and they weren't exporting anymore. So they were buying more from the world than they were selling. And it also led to rent seeking and corruption. You can read about these things more in your textbook, and you want to make sure you get up to speed on ultimately why ISI fails. There was another model during this era, export oriented industrialization, or the East Asian model, which was practiced by a number of small East Asian economies, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, often referred to collectively as the Asian tigers. And in these countries, right, you didn't have the large internal markets. And so many cases, what these countries did is they wanted a development strategy, but they couldn't rely on closing off their economies. So they had to develop a different approach. They still had high barriers on imports. They didn't want to allow those goods in to compete with their infant industries. So they used some protection, although less so. And again, you can read more about this in the text. But they encouraged exports. They didn't want to close off their economies completely from the world market. So they had weak exchange rates, which we'll discuss in a later class how that promotes export competitiveness. The US at this time strategically provided preferential access to its market. That is, the US basically said, we'll let you sell your goods in the American market, and we're not going to expect you to remove your barriers to our goods, in large part because of the Cold War and the desire from the US to help support these Asian economies. The government had a huge influence on the industry, though. Like ISI, the government was still involved, but it was different in some respects. It picked winners. In Korea, it picked these firms that became known as the Jaebils. These were family conglomerates that the government provided all sorts of special benefits to help them become really competitive internationally. The governments provided cheap credit through state-controlled banks like ISI, provided tax breaks as well. But one thing that was very different was in these EOI countries, the government would set export targets. It would actually say you've got to export a certain amount of goods. We want to make sure that you're selling to global markets. And the government would often set quality standards and say, look, you've got to live up to this high standard. We don't want you making products that aren't going to live up to the expectations of American and Japanese and European consumers. So the government was very heavy handed. Like ISI, the state played a huge role in the economy in these places. However, unlike ISI, export oriented industrialization believed that becoming integrated in the global economy was what would lead you to industrialize. And the Asian tigers climbed the industrial ladder rapidly. They moved from low tech sectors to high tech sectors over a period of years. Take a look at this slide here that will explain this a little more clearly. In the 1970s and 80s, textiles and garments were the top exporting sector for Korea. By the 2000s, it was ranked number 9. Semiconductors barely crack the top 10 in the 1980s. By the 1990s, semiconductors make up the number 2 sector of Korean exports. And by the 2000s, they top it. So you're moving from garments and textiles into high tech. Check this out. Automobiles in 1990s, the number 10 sector in Korean exports. By the 2000s, automobiles are up to 7.7, and by 2005, they rank number 2, just behind semiconductors. And so we can see how Korea developed from a very sort of low level, low tech manufacturing to high tech, very capital intensive manufacturing. South Korean chaebols, these firms that the government protected and provided benefits to, just a couple names to give you some ideas. Daewoo, the least famous of the group. Kia, many of you may even have a Kia car. LG, you might have an LG phone or an LG washing machine. Hyundai, obviously a huge car maker today. And Samsung, you might have a Samsung phone in your pocket right now. All of these firms were given all sorts of special assistance from the state in order to help them become competitive globally. They were protected, infant industries, but they were also encouraged to export and become part of the global economy. Despite its success, export oriented industrialization, along with ISI, both models would soon be replaced by a new development model called neoliberalism, and we'll discuss why that was in the next video.